Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Katherine Grill, co-founder and CEO of Neolth, a technology company that provides personalized mental health support to teens through a self-guided platform. Katherine, thank you so much for jumping on the show. I was looking at your background and congrats to all the accolades that you've received. And I know it's probably come from just amounts of hard work, but also focusing on a space that I think a lot of people want to solve, the issue of mental health and accessibility, but it's difficult to, and there's a lot of intricacies to doing so. So I'm really excited to see how you kind of push past those challenges, move past those barriers, but also built in a space that, a lot of people want to affect. But before we get into all that, what were you doing before you started Neo?
Yeah, I was had a bit of a journey, tried a couple different career paths before getting into tech, but it all led me into where I am today. I actually started off painting. Painting was my major in college, which people find a hard time believing. But I did it for about a year, realized pretty quickly it wasn't for me, but I love the expressive arts as a healing modality. So I ended up getting my bachelor's degree in what's called art therapy and really using that as a healing modality within psychiatric care. So I worked in clinical care for a bit, loved it, but felt frustrated by the insurance restrictions and who could and couldn't afford access to care. So ultimately went back to school to get my doctorate in neuroscience. I wanted to learn how to build and create more equitable health programs and really validate them and disseminate them at scale. So I was based in Washington, D.C. I was working at Children's National, which is a pediatric hospital there, doing what's called NIH research or large kind of government funded studies. Did that for a little bit. I was also teaching both neuroscience and psychology at the grad and undergrad level, and ultimately used those experiences to jump into the tech field and to build Neoth.
Incredible. I'm so fascinated by the ability for art to be such a healing experience for a lot of individuals. Being that obviously your background in neuroscience, I have to ask, what are the mechanics in the mind that allow people to heal through art, and even the practice of it, or the expression of it, or the observation of it as well? What's going on within us to help kind of heal through whether it's trauma or things that are maybe even just anxiety and depression and things that we all kind of deal with on the daily.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that we have seen in the technology field is a huge emphasis on talk therapy, traditional psychotherapy, CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. So those modalities can be great. They can be very effective, but you have to understand for certain populations, children and young people, especially older folks, if they're going through things like Alzheimer's or dementia, and people who have experienced trauma can have a really hard time talking about their feelings. And even just, I think all of us, sometimes it can be tough and scary to talk about our feelings, but especially the young kids whose brains haven't fully formed yet, or people who have undergone trauma. There's actually a certain area in the brain called Broca's area, which has to do with verbalization and verbalization of memories. And when you're undergoing a traumatic experience, that area of the brain moves, say it's shut off or there's less activation there. So it's almost impossible to kind of talk about a trauma memory and verbalize it and remember it in that way. So these other sorts of therapies that are expressive arts therapy, you think about art, creative art itself, dance, movement, somatics, all of these things can be really healing and just a great way for people to tap into their feelings without actually needing to have the verbal memory and talk about their feelings. So I think it can be a great alternative to the traditional therapy, and it's definitely less known, but it's becoming more and more popular, and they are evidence-based. There's a good amount of research on them.
Yeah. What do you mentioned, there's this lack of access or inability to access therapies that, I think are extremely preventative in a lot of ways, not even, after there's trauma, but even preventing any poor experience or understanding maybe your own, wants and beliefs and the system around where you act and create action through. What is it that, I guess, causing there to be not a lot of access or an inability to access these types of therapy? Is it institutional? Is it cultural? Is it societal? Is it everything above? What are you seeing that is the biggest barrier for just access to therapy in general, and alternative therapy as well?
Oh gosh, it's also that probably stigma, I would say, both from a historical and cultural perspective is the biggest. So if you look historically, we're in the US, so talking about how we have approached mental health care and treatment and how the media has portrayed mental health and mental illness, people have been really afraid to get mental health and care and afraid of the repercussions, whether that's, financial, losing a
Yeah.
job. We used to put people in institutions and not too long ago, right? So there's a lot of reasons that people had barriers there. And then when you get into the nuances, we could talk about this all day, but looking at specific cultures too, there are some cultures that have more barriers when it comes to accessing mental health care and more stigma there. Finances are always a huge barrier. I think technology is doing a great job at making things more affordable and more accessible. But I would say those two things for sure, the finances and the stigma have been large barriers.
Yeah. Well, I always think about, learning psychology from my undergraduate, the DSM-5 and the different categories of, disorders and mental illnesses and things along that nature. But do you feel like there's still this push to categorize people in certain areas, or is it more so that it's kind of an evolving experience on a spectrum, almost like, the autism spectrum? Is it more of a spectrum of different experiences that people go through that lead to maybe, different mental illnesses that you're seeing? Is it more categorized, or is it becoming more widespread and a little bit more unified, I guess, or on a spectrum on a scale?
Yeah, I would say both, with the caveat that we like to categorize stuff and use the DSM Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and really kind of label folks with a diagnosis. And the reason that happens honestly has to go back to insurance, because once you have a diagnosis, it helps with insurance and processing reasons. Do I personally agree with that? Not really, but that's how the system works. It's kind of waiting until you're really in distress, going to a doctor, getting a diagnosis, having things processed through insurance. That's what we would call the medical model of care, really waiting until you're sick and then getting that diagnosis. A lot of problems with it, as we know. So there's been a huge push, and Neolth is part of this, into moving away from that medical model of care where we're categorizing people and just labeling them by a diagnosis, into what we would call a more preventative model or a wellness model, this kind of continuum where we say, listen, we all have mental health, right? The same way we have physical health, we're thinking about diet, nutrition, exercise, not after we've had a heart attack, but years before. Let's be thinking about mental health, not only end up in the ER because of a crisis, but years before and on a daily basis, where we can teach, especially young people, about mental wellness, about good habits, and about how to manage their stress. So yes, I would say the medical model is still most popular within the US and certainly within the healthcare system. But within more innovative systems within the technology sphere, we're starting to see this push towards this preventative wellness model of care, which I really hope takes off.
Yeah, you mentioned the word wellness, and how would you define wellness? Because I feel like there's a lot of different assumptions about how people would define it themselves. But how would you define it?
Oh, yeah. Wellness has gotten a good and a bad rep, I think, from the past few years. It's really been commodified. So a lot of companies have kind of gone out there and started to work in the wellness space. And that could be anything from, mindfulness and meditation, which has become really popular, to, aromatherapy, to yoga. There have been all these things that have just started popping up. And we're both in California, right? So we know that and we see it all the time. I think everyone should define wellness for themselves. That's one of the most important things that I think about health and wellness, especially being a neuroscientist and looking at it from this perspective of neurodiversity, which is literally, we all have differences in the brain that you could see on brain imaging that would predict how we're going to respond to different treatment, whether it might be something like yoga and mindfulness or medication or social support. It's really cool when you can start to look at it on the biological level. So, wellness for me, I would say, has really a lot of emphasis on prevention and getting to folks before the point of crisis. But I would say everybody needs to, as part of their own journey, explore what wellness means to them and find solutions that really work for them.
What would you say, coming from an academic background, and you said you taught undergrad and even the postdoctoral programs, what was the information that was offered? Because I think there's a stigma, we think about education as being kind of slow to transition to new information and accept information. Is that still the case? And is tech and people who are building within the wellness space and especially mental health space, do they have more information, or is there any collaboration between the two?
Collaboration between industry and academic partners.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That's, I think, a huge area where the field should be moving, and
Mhm.
in some instances is moving. We actually just put out this week, funny that you mentioned it, a call for more academic partners, but we are working with folks like the University of Miami and the University of Iowa, actually integrating our program into schools in the state, looking at things like racial and cultural background and how to tailor the program for certain groups, looking at things like, we call them RCTs, randomized controlled trials, and how to really assess, is this program working, and how to improve it and integrate it into the classroom. So that collaboration between industry and academic partners is going to be key for the health tech space, because it's not just about building a company that makes a lot of money and becomes huge and you can hire a lot of employees, but it's really about building health technology that helps improve people's lives and really works. So the only way to do that is through research and is through these academic partnerships. It, 5 years ago wasn't really happening, but in the past couple of years, it's been happening more and more. And it's just very important for company leadership to prioritize that and to keep pushing for more collaboration.
Yeah. Well, what is, do you think, your biggest benefit or superpower in coming from, a background where you were doing clinical work, and you were teaching, and then you transitioned to technology and are working with these not only academic partners, but, schools and alike and on a customer base? Like, what do you, I can think of a few reasons why I think you have a superpower into the space, but what would you say is the biggest benefit coming from the background you have and leading the charge in mental health technology?
Yeah, it's a timely conversation because there's been a lot of press coming out around some of the drawbacks of mental health companies that have been in the news, engaging in some really unethical behavior. Really, the term that we use here is prioritizing growth over impact. It's this growth at all costs mindset, which happens a lot in the tech industry and the startup industry. Folks might have heard of the, move fast and break things is another way people say that. Maybe in tech, but not in healthcare, right? We're
People.
talking about people's lives. So having leadership on your team who are subject matter experts, who really have worked with patients, who have learned about, good clinical practice is what we call it, have taken ethical training is a real part of our training that we have to undergo. That's huge because it's going to help kind of trickle down into company culture when we're making these decisions around, do we do the scale and the growth as quickly as possible, or do we prioritize the impact and the safety? It's something that we haven't seen enough in health tech. It's something that we certainly are doing at Neos and that we're really proud of.
Yeah. How do you balance that out? Prioritizing growth and scaling versus impact.
Yeah, you have to come together as a leadership team and really discuss it. I think at the beginning of the company, at the origins of the company, and then have a commitment to stay true to that. A really important thing that has helped us is being mindful around investors and venture investors and who we're taking money from. We've been fortunate to have fantastic investors like Velocity, like Headstream, who are youth mental health focused, who are very much so impact investors, and who are mission aligned, where they're okay with us saying, you know what, you're going to grow. We're growing really quickly. I would say we're growing really quickly, but, compared to some technology companies, they're going to say, it doesn't matter, keep growing. Don't spend any money on, research. Don't spend any money on academic partnerships. Well, we have investors who think the opposite. So for us, finding those folks, whether it's partners or investors or leadership, company leadership and employees who are mission aligned, that's a way that we make sure that we're still really focused on the clinical impact and the health of our patients.
And tell us a little bit about how Neoth works. How is the platform integrated in these schools or otherwise to impact, the mental health of teens?
Because from my background, as we talked about, I used to be a therapist and work clinically in care, and saw a lot of reasons why that was hard for folks, especially young people. It can be really scary to talk to anyone about your feelings, especially an adult, and it can be really expensive. And oftentimes, it's not the first step to care. When you look at research and you look at teens and their behavior around mental health, the first thing that they're doing is going to like Reddit, YouTube, TikTok. They're searching online for mental health and they're watching, influencers or other short videos or reading blogs about health. Therapy is not the first step. Not that it's not important, it can be really helpful and life-saving, but it's just never going to be the first step. So we wanted to really get together with young people and talk that through and understand, what are your entry points to care? how can we be that first line of defense for you and teach about mental health and education and help you get care if you need it, but also help you learn good skills to prevent a crisis. So that's how we built Neolth, co-developed in partnership with a couple hundred young folks. It's really a self-guided mobile app. It focuses on, like I said, education, stigma reduction, skill building. It's almost like you could think of a Netflix or a YouTube where we have AI that's personalizing content for these young people, whether it's videos from doctors, videos from their own peers about lived experiences, guided relaxation practices. We help them track their progress. And we also have AI that can do crisis monitoring. So if something's going on where they're really struggling, we can in real time do care escalation to a crisis resource or to a clinician if they need it.
Yeah, it's incredible. People don't think about partnering with their consumer often as a vehicle for building, but on the show, I've heard time and time again how beneficial it is to build something with your consumers, because they will oftentimes guide you to exactly, where your product needs to be, or exactly where, you need to grow. What are some of the, I guess, thinking more about the challenges of offering care with teens, what are some of the more regulatory barriers that you have that people don't necessarily consider? We think, oh, it's a mobile app, people can download it, people can access it, but I'm sure there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes to be able to actually do so impactfully.
Yeah, this goes back to the importance of having folks on your team to understand healthcare. I used to work at Children's National. It was in DC. It was right down the road from Silver Spring and really the FDA, right in their headquarters. So quite familiar with working with them on regulation. Really right now, their stance is they're regulating programs that are diagnosing specific conditions, are treating conditions. So if we were to say this is an app that is treating depression, for example, there are some apps out there. Limbix is one of them that has FDA approval. They need to go through that regulation path. But for us with Neolth, we're really focused on stress management, social emotional learning. We do have some young folks who have a condition, but we would never tell them, hey, stop treatment. Neolth is your treatment. It's really more of a complementary tool. So in that use case, as long as you're very clear about it, you don't need to go through FDA regulation. You actually wouldn't be able to apply. There's no pathway. So for us, that helped with commercialization and really being able to get to market right away. But it's, of course, important to kind of keep your eye on the regulatory landscape and how things are changing, because those regulations do change over time.
Yeah. How is the younger generation accepting mental illness mental health, and mental health practices that is maybe either similar or different from previous generations? I think about my parents' generation, and my grandparents were immigrants. Mental health is not necessarily talked about in Mexican culture, but it's now becoming more integrated, which I love because it shows the evolution of caring and being healthy for longevity. But what are ways that you're seeing the younger generations accepting of mental health that's different?
They are so accepting. One thing that's just a funny nuance that we learned when I was a clinician working in the hospitals, we did a lot of times these wellness programs. We call them stress management programs. And through working with young people, the older generation likes that term because mental health is more stigmatized. But we actually heard it's the opposite. They want to get right into it, actually talk about mental health. They don't want it to be called stress management. So that's just an interesting, I think, marketing learning that we had from working with the young people. But there are a lot of misconceptions. I would say people are thinking that young people are so open about mental health that there's no stigma. That's not true at all. There's actually recent research that came out this year that was saying there is still a lot of stigma, and it's stigma towards themselves. So themselves struggling to talk about what's going on with them, struggling to go and get treatment, but they're very open to talk about mental health in group settings and to want to help their peers. So understanding that, again, going back to those kind of initial entry points to care, if you can get them into group settings, if you can get them kind of from this altruistic mindset, talking about mental health and wanting to help peers, it can become a stepping stone to being comfortable getting help for themselves. So that's a really important nuance that we need to understand, where in older generations, mental health just in general was completely stigmatized. There's still stigma in the younger generation, but it's more about them and themselves and getting care for themselves.
It's fascinating the evolution of it, and how that there still is stigma, even though it's a more open conversation. But I'm not sure if this is right or wrong. but it seems like from my perspective, it's like a vulnerability. It's just hard to kind of put your guard down in a lot of ways to either acknowledge or get help for something that you're dealing with. It's fast. I love learning the neuroscience component because, the way to verbalize, what your experience has been through state trauma. I didn't even think about that as a fundamental way that impedes of someone from actually, talking about something. Thinking about from a go-to-market strategy as we're behind company lines, we work with, B2B, B2C software and technology companies. What is the go-to-market strategy for a mental health kind of self-guided platform? Is it, grassroots campaigns? Is it going into school, having ambassadors? What are ways that have been successful, and go-to-market for your company?
Yeah. So I guess very high level, we thought about this. Of course, as we're starting any company, you're really doing a lot of research on this. And importantly, we brought the young kids into conversations with us to get a sense of, hey, where do you think we should start with go-to-market? Where would you actually utilize Neolth? One of the things that we found, as anyone knows, if you're going direct to consumer, you need a lot of money in marketing dollars, but also it's just an additional barrier because young people might not have credit cards or they might not have the access to pay for an app directly on the app store. And it really felt like it was against our mission of increasing access to care. So we do have an app on the app store, but that's not really our main channel. We focus more on going through enterprise partnerships who pay for it. That way it's completely free for the young people. We wanted to start with schools because we feel very strongly, again, in reaching young people before the point of crisis and normalizing mental health. And a great way to do that is to integrate into the curriculum. So the same way we're learning math and science on a daily basis, if we're talking about mental health from day one in school on a daily basis, that stigma, hopefully in the next years, in the next generation, will be completely gone. So that for us was important to really work through the schools. But as people who work in ed tech know, that's a pretty hard thing to do. Ed tech is just slower moving than a lot of other industries. So while you do the kind of traditional enterprise sales, we've done a lot on kind of grassroots, like you mentioned, community building and bottoms up growth. One of the main things that we've done that's been fantastic is been building an ambassador program. So I believe we've had now over 400 young people who have come through the company who have been able to learn about mental health, build a virtual community, touch each other, really get the opportunity to discuss mental health, help us build the product, go out there and try to advocate and bring it back to their school. So it becomes this kind of threefold thing where they're getting peer support and virtual community. They're helping learn about the product and how to build up the product. And then, we're also going out there and getting more growth from the schools. And for us, that's been a really successful strategy that we're going to continue for sure.
My question was, tell us a little bit about the growth. How many students are using your platform or teens, and how many schools are you working with? And then what are the kind of your future projections for, the rest of this year and also into next year?
Yeah, the growth has been fantastic. I do think it is a function of right product, right time, just given that, we spent the past couple of years in a pandemic, but also really because of our work with young people and our mission, focused on the impact. That's just been something that I think people notice, that authenticity, and it helps attract young people because they do care about, the companies and the ethos. And that's becoming more and more important in these younger generations. Right now, we're in, I think, about 330 schools in the US, working across the K-12 and higher ed levels with students ages 11 plus. We just expanded into the APAC region, into 20 countries in Asia. So we're really excited about that. And that's going to be a big new step for us, seeing how we can launch internationally and how other students and other cultures really use the app. As you know, there will be differences there. So the growth has been there. It's moving along, but it's always an exercise in determination and persistence when you're working with the schools. We've started to do a lot of research, which has been fantastic. We recently partnered with the University of Miami and Dr. Aziz there. They are doing a study this year with 7,000 students. So it's one of the largest studies I know of digital mental health in the schools. I really focused on students of color as well, working in the Miami community, of course, and in the schools there. So just seeing again, thinking about things like community, thinking about things like culture, how does that influence somebody's kind of willingness to utilize mental health care, and how do we need to go into a community and tailor the program to meet those students' needs? So those have been some of the projects that we're working on this year that I'm really excited about.
Yeah, that's incredible. The amount of focus and attention you have towards the differences that people go through, and I think the having that focal point will increase the access to different communities. Especially, I come from a Mexican American community, and it's a lot of the what hinders that community from getting help is not feeling understood based on the experience or culture, of whomever is helping. So it's incredible to see that research being done. What are the biggest challenges that Neolth faces today?
Yeah, there are always challenges. For us, we feel great about the product. We have fantastic research partners, like we talked about. The ability to co-develop with the young people has been huge for us, and we continue to be leading in areas like student satisfaction and student engagement. But you get to this point where after you've started to build a product, you really need to get to commercialization, and I think that's across the board tricky for companies, especially when we're having this mindset of, okay, integrity is important to us. We want to think about the impact, and we want to grow, but we want to grow sustainably, and we want to grow while really having a positive impact on the community. So that's been the biggest challenge for us, especially working with the venture community and trying to find investors who are mission aligned, because when you start to take on folks, you take on money, that's a great thing. But when they're part of your board and they can be making decisions, if they're not mission aligned, it creates friction. So for us, that's been a challenge that we're working through. We've been fortunate, like I said, to have some really fantastic investors, and just kind of keep chugging along and keep that commitment to our integrity. It's
Yeah,
not always easy, but we do think it's the right thing to do.
yeah. What's if everything goes well, what's the long-term vision for Neolth?
It has to be around this normalization of mental health care. So many of the people I thought, the clinician, and so many of the stories that you hear, especially during the pandemic, uh, that are heartbreaking around kids really struggling, dying by suicide. It didn't have to get to that point. And that's the thing that's so, I think, devastating for me and for the companies. It didn't have to get there. So we like to imagine this world where from day one, you're going into the school as a young person, you're talking about mental health every day, the same way you're learning about math and science. We're doing so in a way that we're thinking about culture and generational preferences for care. Like as we've talked about on this call, it's not just about taking whatever's the most popular, like CBT or mindfulness, and kind of whitewashing the programs, but it's really thinking about all the different folks and how we can support them and understand, their backgrounds. So for us, having that in the school on a daily basis, normalizing mental health, and making sure we're supporting some of our most vulnerable folks who have often been forgotten by mental health care, that's our long-term vision. Yep.
What's particularly hard about your job?
Everything. I'm sorry. Yeah, I guess I would say it changes over time. And that's one thing that I've had to build up a kind of mental attitude around, is that as soon as you're starting to feel like, I got it, I'm doing the right stuff, I'm comfortable, there's a new challenge. And you're like, oh crap, I don't know. Everything has changed. I have no idea how to do this. So at first it was kind of building a team, right? And then as soon as I got the yes, and then we had to build a product. I'm like, I've done this before in health, I can do this. And now we've done that and we feel great, but we're on to commercialization. So it's just like every time you start to get to that place where you're feeling comfortable and you're like, I understand it, there's a new challenge. But that's also a really exciting part of being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, yeah. I always like to ask this question, one for selfish research, but also for my audience as well. What books or people have influenced you the most, whether it was early in your career or even today as you work through the challenges of building a company?
Yeah, people. Can I talk about people in my personal life, or are you wanting like real, like also
Whomever.
than other folks people will know? Okay. Well, I'll talk about my personal life. My mom, for one person, she's really influenced me. She was a young mother growing up. I thought she was so cool because uh, when she got pregnant, realized she needed to make ends meet. She actually started her own cleaning services company and worked as a maid. And like, how many people do you know who are a teenager and who go out and do that? I just think she's such a a badass for doing that, and maybe where I get some of my entrepreneurial spirit. So she's somebody who I really have a lot of admiration for. And then also my grandfather, who's somebody who I grew up with and lived with growing up. He was a firefighter in New York in the FDNY, and probably a big part of the reason why I have my drive for social impact and helping others. Growing up with somebody like that and seeing, every day kind of how they stepped out into the world and really thought about others before themselves was something that stuck with me, and it's something that I want to bring to the work I'm doing at Neolth.
And well, Catherine, thank you so much for everything that you've covered in the show, not only from your experience academically and but also professionally with building companies. And it's such a beautiful weave of information and activity that Neolth is doing, and in a way that I think is extremely I don't know if it's generous or if it's got a lot of humility in it, but it just seems right. Focusing on impact and doing the work that's necessary to actually achieve that impact has been incredible to learn about. Last little bit, I always like to give a chance for our founders to let us know where to find them. What are your LinkedIn's, your Twitters, your website? Where can we find and support the mission that you all are heading towards?
Yeah, so if you want to find me personally, I would say LinkedIn, Katherine Grill, Katherine with the K. Grill is Grill. You should be able to find me. I don't have many personal social accounts, so don't try to look. You won't have much luck. But LinkedIn is a place you can find me. And the company is across all socials. So Neolth, Neolth is our handle. Also, our website is neolth.com. And we're on the App Store as well. We have free access for anybody ages 11 plus. So if you're wanting to learn about mental health, wanting some extra support, you're able to access us on the App Store.
Incredible. Catherine, thank you so much. I really hope you enjoyed your time, and I can't wait to share this episode with our audience, and hopefully, there's more downloads that come from this as well. But I like I said, I hope you enjoyed your time, and thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Julian.